She boarded the plane with her husband and 2 kids, calm, respectful, and holding 4 first-class tickets. But just minutes after sitting down, a flight attendant walked over and told her she had to move to the back of the plane. No explanation, no questions, just a quiet demand. Her children watched in confusion as their mother stood up and walked away without a word. The whole cabin watched too, but no one said anything. What no one knew was that this woman wasn't just another passenger. She was the wife of the man who owned the airline. And what happened after she was forced out of her seat turned the entire flight upside down. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The airport was calm, just before the rush of boarding, when Darren, Elise, and their 2 kids arrived at the gate. Their daughter Paige clutched her small pink travel bag, eyes wide with excitement, while her little brother Noah swung their father's hand and asked questions about the plane. Darren answered each one with a patient smile. Elise walked beside them, her arm gently resting on Paige's shoulder, her voice low and warm as she reminded them to stay close and be respectful. The family looked ordinary, well-dressed, polite, and quiet, but there was something in the way they moved together. Calm, confident, peaceful. At the gate, the staff scanned their first-class boarding passes with no issue. Elise thanked the agent. Darren nodded, holding the boarding slips in one hand and Noah's small backpack in the other. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. Once on board, the children were full of energy, curious about the seat buttons and how far the recliner would go. Paige pressed hers gently, watching the seat glide back with amazement. Elise chuckled and helped her get settled. Darren took the aisle seat beside Noah and gave him a pair of headphones. First class felt like a treat and the kids were soaking up every second of it. Then came a shadow. "Excuse me," a flight attendant said, stopping in front of them. Her name tag read, Ms. Keller. Her hair was pinned back tight, and she held a small tablet as she glanced across the family. Her smile was thin, forced. "There seems to be a seating mix-up." Darren looked up, puzzled but calm. "We checked in at the counter. These are our seats. Row 2, A through D." "Yes," Ms. Keller replied, her voice steady but brisk. "There's a manifest issue. It appears there's a discrepancy, and we'll need to rearrange seating to fix the balance in the cabin." Elise furrowed her brow. "We're traveling together, a family of 4. "I understand," Ms. Keller said, although her tone didn't match her words. "But I'll need you, ma'am, to move to the back so we can seat a confirmed elite passenger here. Just a quick adjustment." Elise blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, but we booked these seats weeks ago. We're not standby. These are paid first-class tickets." "I understand," Miss Keller repeated, her smile now gone, replaced by a hardened look. "But I'll need your cooperation. We can't delay the boarding process. Please move to the back." Darren sat up straighter. "Why her?" he asked quietly. "Why not anyone else in this row?" Ms. Keller tilted her head, eyes sharp. "Sir, I don't have time for an argument. Either she moves or I'll have to call the ground crew." Passengers nearby started glancing over. A businessman 2 rows ahead lowered his newspaper. A couple on the other side turned to watch, but no one said anything. Not yet. Elise gave Darren a brief look, silent understanding passing between them. She turned to Paige and kissed her on the forehead. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'll just be a few rows back." She picked up her bag slowly, her eyes burning, but she didn't let it show. Paige grabbed her sleeve, whispering, "Why do you have to go?" Elise forced a smile. "Just for a little while." Noah stared at Ms. Keller, his small hands clenching the armrests. Darren said nothing, only watched as his wife was quietly led away, not offered help, not given even the smallest apology. The row felt colder after she left. Paige slouched deeper in her seat. Noah stopped smiling. Darren reached out and held their hands. His eyes stayed forward, calm, watching, waiting. He hadn't said everything yet, but he would. Elise walked down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane, her shoulders straight but her eyes heavy. She passed row after row of indifferent faces, some pretending not to notice, others stealing quiet glances. Not one person spoke. Not one offered to switch. As she reached her new seat near the back, she placed her bag down and sat stiffly between two strangers. The space felt cramped, cold. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, trying not to think about how far she now sat from her family. Up in first class, Darren remained still. Paige leaned against his shoulder, her voice small. Why did they make Mom move? Noah looked from his sister to his father, confused. She didn't do anything. I know, Darren said softly. She didn't. A few rows ahead, Ms. Keller walked with her usual precision, speaking to other passengers with a pleasant tone as if nothing had happened. She offered drinks, fluffed pillows, and handed out hot towels. But when she walked past Darren's row, her voice grew more formal. She didn't look him in the eye, she didn't offer anything to Paige or Noah. Noah watched her walk away. She didn't ask if we wanted juice. Darren's jaw tightened slightly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. With one hand resting on Noah's shoulder, he began typing. They moved Elise to the back, split us up. Attendant didn't believe the seating was correct. Said she needed the seat for someone more important. He hit send. A moment later, a reply came. Which flight? Darren typed back the number. There was no need to explain more. The message was read instantly. Back in economy, Elise's phone buzzed in her bag. She slipped it out and read her husband's message. Her eyes scanned the screen, and she took a deep breath. Then came a second message, just 2 words. Don't worry. She placed the phone in her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. On the other side of the plane, Ms. Keller was speaking to a flight attendant trainee named Jenna. Jenna had witnessed the entire exchange earlier but hadn't said a word. She kept her head down and followed instructions, but her face still held a trace of unease. Did you check the tickets? Jenna asked carefully. I saw them, Ms. Keller replied. But things like this happen. People book through points, get upgrades from friends. That doesn't mean they belong up here. Jenna stayed quiet. She glanced down the aisle where Elise had disappeared, then looked back toward Darren's row. Paige was staring out the window. Noah was holding his father's arm. Something about the entire moment sat wrong in her stomach. Meanwhile, Darren's phone buzzed again. One new message. Sit tight, I'm handling it. Darren read it, put his phone away, and gently reached for Paige's headphones. Let's watch something together, he said, smiling softly. She nodded. Noah leaned in. They didn't know what was coming next, but Darren did, and so did the person on the other end of that message. In the cockpit, the calm hum of the engine mixed with the quiet chatter of the crew radio. Captain Reynolds was reviewing weather patterns when a blinking message flashed on the in-flight communication screen. He tapped it open, and his face shifted slightly as he read the urgent notification marked Executive Alert. He leaned back in his seat and exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. Contact from the board, he said. Looks like we've got someone important in the cabin. He picked up the handset connected to the crew intercom and dialed a direct line to the head flight attendant's panel. Ms. Keller was in the galley, pouring sparkling water for a passenger, when the call light lit up. She wiped her hands, pressed the button, and answered. Cabin service, Keller speaking. Ms. Keller, the captain said, his voice steady, but with a weight behind it. I need you to report to the cockpit, now. There was a short pause. Understood, she replied quickly, then hung up. As she made her way to the front, her steps slowed just slightly. Something about the captain's tone didn't feel normal. When she entered the cockpit, both pilots turned their chairs toward her. Close the door, Captain Reynolds said. She did. Then he gestured toward the monitor beside him. You removed a passenger from first class this morning. Can you explain why? Ms. Keller blinked. Yes, sir. There was a seating conflict. The woman didn't appear on the elite upgrade list and was seated with 3 others, her husband and children. I assumed she had been placed there in error. You assumed, the captain repeated. And you didn't confirm with the manifest? I glanced over it, but I was trying to avoid delay. She didn't match the profile of... She caught herself mid-sentence. I didn't mean... Captain Reynolds raised a hand to stop her. Ms. Keller, the man in seat 2C is Darren Whitmore. She didn't respond. Ring any bells? He asked. Ms. Keller's throat tightened. No, sir. He's the CEO of the holding group that owns this airline. The silence that followed made the cabin feel smaller. The co-pilot cleared his throat. He's not just a top executive. He's the one who signs our paychecks. Ms. Keller's face lost all color. I didn't know. You didn't bother to know, the captain corrected her. He texted the board directly. You removed his wife from first class, separated their family, no verification, no cross-check, just a public decision based on your judgment. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her mouth was dry, her hands cold. The captain continued. I've been instructed to inform you that upon landing, you'll be met by airport security and 2 board representatives. You are to remain professional until that time. And in the meantime, you are to personally escort Mrs. Whitmore back to first class. Publicly. With an apology, Ms. Keller's knees felt weak. Yes, sir, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You may return to the cabin, the captain said, then added firmly, and don't make it worse. Ms. Keller exited the cockpit, her steps unsteady now. Her grip on the galley door tightened as she pulled it open. The soft clinking of ice in glasses and the gentle hum of passengers chatting felt like a wave crashing over her. But the energy had changed. Something was different. Eyes followed her now. A quiet tension filled the air. Darren hadn't moved from his seat, but he looked up and met her eyes as she approached. She paused. This was the part she hadn't prepared for. Ms. Keller walked down the aisle with a stiff smile stretched across her face, but her hands trembled just enough to make her grip the seatbacks for balance. Every step toward the back felt heavier than the last. The passengers she had once ignored or brushed past now watched her closely. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. She hated that feeling, being seen for the wrong reasons. When she reached Elise's row, the woman was sitting upright, earbuds in, a calm expression on her face, though her eyes were tired. Elise looked up slowly when Ms. Keller stopped in front of her and removed one earbud. Mrs. Whitmore, Ms. Keller began, lowering her voice. There's been a mistake. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat. Elise didn't move. She blinked, but her face didn't change. A mistake? Ms. Keller nodded. Yes. We reviewed the manifest again. There was an error on our end. Elise glanced at the man on her left and the woman on her right, strangers who had said nothing when she arrived earlier. She then looked back at Miss Keller. So now I'm allowed to sit with my family? Yes, Miss Keller replied, barely managing to keep her voice steady. I apologize for the inconvenience. Elise gathered her bag but didn't rise immediately. You didn't ask anyone else to move, she said, her tone calm but pointed. You didn't even check twice. Ms. Keller's lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but nothing came out. I had my ticket, Elise continued. I sat in the seat assigned to me, and still you asked me to leave. You didn't hesitate. Not once. Passengers nearby leaned in slightly, pretending to look at their tray tables or magazines, but every ear was tuned in. I may not wear a business suit or flash a badge, Elise said, standing slowly, but I know what first class looks like, and what it feels like to be told I don't belong. Ms. Keller's face turned pale. I made a misjudgment. I'm sorry. Elise didn't say anything. She simply walked forward, past the staring passengers, her chin lifted. Not out of pride, but because she refused to let her dignity fall behind her. Paige turned first when she saw her mother walking back up the aisle. Her face lit up. Mom! Noah grinned, bouncing in his seat. Darren stood up to help her, his eyes never leaving Ms. Keller, who stood awkwardly a few rows away. Elise sat back down, this time between her children, and leaned slightly toward Darren. He gave her hand a small squeeze. Ms. Keller stepped forward. her voice low but audible. "If there's anything you need during the rest of the flight, please let me know." Elise looked at her but said nothing. Darren finally spoke. "You sure there's not another seat in the back?" Ms. Keller forced a weak smile, took a step back, and turned away. The cabin was silent for a moment, and then quietly things resumed. Tray tables lowered, seat belts adjusted, but the air hadn't returned to normal. It couldn't, because the people who had witnessed what happened now understood what it meant. And for Ms. Keller, every glance she met now felt different. She wasn't respected. She was being watched. Back in the galley, Ms. Keller gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breath came fast and shallow, though she tried to steady it. She wasn't used to being questioned, not by passengers, and definitely not like that. She had been with the airline for years. She had handled difficult situations, unruly travelers, even emergencies. But this was different. This was personal, and it was unraveling quickly. Jenna, the junior flight attendant, stood nearby, quietly restocking the drink cart. She watched Ms. Keller out of the corner of her eye. After a long silence, she spoke. "You didn't expect that, did you?" Ms. Keller turned sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jenna shrugged, careful not to sound too bold. "I mean, I saw how you looked at them. Like you already knew they didn't belong." Ms. Keller's jaw tightened. "I followed procedure." "No," Jenna said softly. "You didn't." There was no anger in her voice, just something cold and still. Ms. Keller looked away, pretending to check inventory. Her fingers fumbled with the tray labels. "Do you know who he is?" Jenna asked after a moment. Ms. Keller hesitated. "I do now." Jenna's voice dropped. "He owns us." Ms. Keller didn't answer. She stared at the drink cart, trying to pretend she still had control of the situation. But it was slipping from her hands, and there was no script for what came next. In first class, Elise leaned her head against the seat, her eyes closed. Paige held her hand tightly, refusing to let go. Noah was quietly coloring on the tray table, and Darren stared straight ahead, his jaw firm but unreadable. His phone buzzed once. A message had come in. "Video is circulating already. Front office saw it." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what that meant. People had recorded the moment Elise was escorted back to first class. The passengers had been silent, but not blind. Phones had captured the tension, the words, the silence that screamed just as loud. One row over, a man in a gray suit leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said to Darren. "I just want to say, what happened earlier, it wasn't right." Darren glanced at him, then back at his family. "No, it wasn't." The man cleared his throat. "She should be ashamed. She should be accountable," Darren replied. There was a difference, one that couldn't be ignored. At the front of the plane, the intercom buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was the ground team. "Flight 407, confirm receipt of priority landing notice. Passenger transfer team and board liaison will be at the gate." The co-pilot acknowledged the message, but Captain Reynolds was already preparing for what came next. He had flown for decades. He had seen delayed flights, air rage incidents, even security threats. But nothing turned more dangerous than unchecked ego in a position of power. He looked out the window at the clouds passing beneath them, and he quietly shook his head. This wasn't going to end in the sky. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. It wasn't just the quiet anymore. It was the weight. Everyone felt it. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was thick, like a pressure settling over the passengers who had watched it all unfold and said nothing. Some scrolled through their phones to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. Others sat unusually still, pretending to nap. And a few kept glancing at Darren and Elise's row, their expressions mixed with guilt, curiosity, and discomfort. No one wanted to be caught staring, but no one could look away for too long either. Darren sat upright, glancing now and then at Paige and Noah. Paige leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, still gripping her hand. Noah had stopped coloring and now sat quietly, looking toward the front of the plane with the sort of serious expression only a child carries when he knows something unfair has happened, but doesn't quite understand why. Elise hadn't said a word since she came back. She simply sat with her family, head held high, but her eyes were tired. Her dignity remained intact, but it had taken effort, more than anyone else on that flight could possibly know. She glanced at Darren's hands resting on his lap. His fingers were still, but his jaw was set, and the stillness in his posture wasn't calm. It was calculated. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Statement draft is ready if you want to make it public. He didn't type back right away. Instead, he glanced toward the galley. Ms. Keller still hadn't returned. In the back of the plane, she stood with her arms crossed tightly, as if trying to shield herself from the cold air that didn't exist. Her uniform felt like it no longer fit. Her shoes pinched. Her name tag felt heavier than it had that morning. She had taken a seat on the crew bench, pretending to organize paperwork, but she hadn't moved in nearly 10 minutes. Jenna stood by the beverage station, arms folded, watching her in silence. She hadn't said anything since their last exchange. Ms. Keller felt her presence without even looking. That made it worse. "You ever think about why you did it?" Jenna finally asked, breaking the quiet. Ms. Keller didn't answer. "You saw a family that didn't look the way you expected," Jenna said, her voice low but firm. "You didn't check their names, you didn't check their history with the airline. You didn't even check your own bias." "I didn't do it on purpose," Ms. Keller muttered, though it sounded weak even to her. "You didn't have to," Jenna said. "That's the problem." Ms. Keller stood suddenly, brushing past Jenna and walking up the aisle. She couldn't sit still anymore. The air felt too tight. Her thoughts were circling, fast and unrelenting. She tried to focus on the small tasks, straighten a tray here, adjust a headrest there. But the stares followed her. The passengers might have pretended to be polite earlier, but she could feel it now. Every time she moved, someone was watching. She turned her head toward Darren's row for a brief second and caught his eye. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, and somehow that was worse than if he had shouted. She turned away quickly and returned to the galley. Her heart was pounding now, 1,000 thoughts racing. What would happen when the plane landed? Was this going to be a suspension? A formal write-up? Maybe just a warning? But deep down, even she knew it wasn't going to be any of those things. It was going to be bigger, louder, permanent. Because it wasn't just a complaint anymore. It wasn't even just a mistake. It was a decision, a moment, one she could never rewind. And as the minutes ticked by and the pilot quietly announced their descent, Ms. Keller looked around the galley as if it might be the last time she'd ever stand there. Because chances were, it was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its smooth descent. A soft chime sounded overhead, followed by the captain's calm voice coming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent and will be landing shortly. Please return to your seats, fasten your seat belts, and make sure all tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." The announcement was routine, but nothing about the mood on board felt normal. It was quiet, yes, but not the kind of quiet that comes from calm. It was tense, heavy, uneasy. The kind of quiet that comes after a moment people know they should have spoken up for, but didn't. Darren helped Noah buckle his seatbelt again, then reached across to make sure Paige was secure. Elise didn't speak. She had barely said anything since returning to her seat, and that silence said more than words ever could. She kept her hand in Paige's, and her other hand rested lightly on her lap, fingers tapping slowly, thoughtfully. Darren glanced down at his phone. 2 new messages had come through. "Media is aware. There's footage. It's circulating on 2 platforms. Board already reviewed it. They'll meet her at the gate. HR's involved." He turned off the screen and slipped the phone into the seat pocket. His shoulders stayed square, his chin level. Not a single word had come from him publicly yet. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't called for consequences in front of anyone. He didn't have to. Power, real power, didn't announce itself. It just moved, quietly but permanently. 2 rows ahead, the man in the gray suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been one of the first to look away when Ms. Keller confronted Elise, one of the first to pretend he didn't hear. He had glanced back several times since then, as if searching for a moment to say something meaningful, but each time his courage folded under the weight of the silence. Now, as the plane descended lower through the clouds, he looked down at his own hands, ashamed. Across the aisle, a young woman tapped rapidly on her phone, whispering to her seatmate. She had filmed the earlier scene when Elise had returned. The apology, the walk of shame, the emotion that hung in the air. She hadn't posted it for attention. She had posted it because it made her angry, because it felt wrong, and because she knew that if people saw it, it might make them think twice the next time someone got singled out just for not fitting the first-class picture. In the galley, Ms. Keller was frozen in place, still gripping the metal rail. Her reflection in the mirror across from her looked unfamiliar, pale, anxious, stripped of the usual authority she carried like armor. She straightened her collar, then her name tag, as if doing so might undo the hours that had already passed. But nothing she fixed now could erase what had been done. Her headset crackled quietly. The captain's voice came through, not to the passengers this time, but just for the crew. Flight 407, final approach, gate team in place, medical and security standing by. Medical and security. Ms. Keller's stomach dropped. Her mouth went dry. She had hoped this would stay between the passengers and the flight crew. She had hoped it would be handled quietly, like most complaints. Maybe a disciplinary warning, a few retraining sessions. But this was no longer an internal note in her personnel file. This was turning into a headline. And the worst part, she had handed it to them herself. In first class, Elise sat straighter, her eyes fixed out the window. The city skyline was beginning to appear through the thinning clouds. A quiet storm of thoughts moved behind her calm face. She had been embarrassed in front of strangers, removed like a problem, spoken to like she didn't belong in a place she paid for. But still, she held herself together. Paige turned to her and whispered, "Are we almost there?" Elise smiled softly. Almost. Darren adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window as well. He said nothing. Not to Elise, not to his children, not to anyone around him. But his silence wasn't passive. It was waiting. Because the real storm hadn't begun yet. It was waiting just beyond the gate. The landing was smooth, the wheels meeting the runway with a soft bump that signaled the end of the flight. But not the end of the story. As the plane rolled gently toward the gate, a strange stillness spread through the cabin. The usual hum of activity that followed landing. Passengers reaching for phones, seatbelts unbuckling prematurely, flight attendants prepping announcements, was missing. No one moved. The silence was sharp. Darren remained still, one hand resting on his thigh, the other gently holding Noah's shoulder. Elise sat beside him, eyes forward, quiet strength in her posture. Paige had stopped fidgeting, sensing something was different. She didn't ask any more questions. She simply waited, her small fingers wrapped tightly around her mother's. Outside, the terminal drew closer through the windows, the bright airport lights shining through the evening haze. The jet bridge was already in place. 2 uniformed officers stood near the glass corridor, along with a man in a dark suit wearing an airline operations badge clipped to his chest. His arms were crossed, face unreadable, eyes locked on the aircraft as it crept toward the gate. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds finished the final checks, removed his headset, and exhaled through his nose. He glanced at the co-pilot, who gave a short nod. "They're here," the co-pilot muttered. "I figured," the captain replied. "Can't say I'm surprised." Back in the galley, Miss Keller wiped her palms on her skirt for the 3rd time. Her nerves were frayed now. She had tried to maintain composure, tried to stay in control of her expression, her voice, her movements. But it was gone. That quiet dignity that had always come with her senior title, the unspoken confidence she carried down the aisles, it had vanished. Her reflection in the stainless steel panel looked unfamiliar. A person who had lost grip of something she thought was secure. Jenna stood nearby, folding napkins, stacking cups, pretending to busy herself, but her eyes kept flicking toward the front of the plane. She hadn't said anything since Ms. Keller returned from the cockpit, but the way she moved, the stiffness in her jaw made her thoughts obvious. "You think they'll really?" Ms. Keller began, but her voice trailed off. Jenna didn't look at her. She just said, "They're waiting." Ms. Keller swallowed hard. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 4:10 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for flying with us today." The seatbelt light remained on. The plane stopped at the gate. No one stood. Then, the cabin door clicked open. 2 security officers stepped aboard. One remained just inside the threshold. The other spoke quietly to the lead attendant stationed by the front galley. Then came the words. Clear, calm, direct. "Ms. Keller?" A few passengers gasped quietly. Others didn't move but leaned forward ever so slightly, trying not to be obvious, though everyone was watching now. Some even held their phones in their hands, not filming yet, but ready. Ms. Keller rose slowly, her knees stiff, face pale. She straightened her blazer out of habit. Her feet felt heavy as she stepped out of the galley. Is there something?" she began, but the officer didn't answer her question. "You'll need to come with us." The man in the suit standing just outside the doorway stepped forward. "You're being asked to report directly to the airline board liaison and HR team. A formal investigation has been opened." Ms. Keller looked around. The words didn't fully register at first. "Investigation?" she repeated, but the tone was final. The officer gestured again. "This way, please." She looked toward the cabin, scanning the faces of the passengers she had served, or ignored, throughout the flight. Her eyes paused for half a second on Darren, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just watched her like a man who had already said everything he needed to say. Then she looked away. With one last breath, she stepped out of the plane, her shoes clicking faintly against the bridge floor. Behind her, the silence lingered like smoke. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt light dinged off. A new energy swept through the space, soft but undeniable. Not celebration, not revenge, just correction. A long overdue correction. Jenna stood near the galley, quietly watching the doorway as it closed again. Then, after a moment, she walked down the aisle toward Darren and Elise's row. She knelt slightly, just enough to speak softly. "Would your family like anything before you disembark? Water, maybe something for the kids?" Elise smiled, just a little. "No, thank you. We're fine." Jenna nodded once. She stood and turned back, her steps light and steady. Somewhere behind her, a few passengers began to rise, collecting their bags in silence. But no one had forgotten what they'd seen, and no one would forget who they had ignored. The aisle buzzed with soft movement now. Passengers slowly rose from their seats, reaching overhead for their luggage. But the energy wasn't the same as on most flights. People weren't rushing to leave. They weren't laughing or talking. They moved cautiously, almost quietly, like the cabin had become something sacred, marked by a moment they couldn't pretend didn't happen. Some looked toward Darren and Elise, quickly looking away again. A few nodded faintly, like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. Words were tricky now. Guilt hung over the aisle, not spoken but present, unmistakable. The family remained seated. Darren showed no interest in standing until the crowd had cleared. Elise gently brushed a hand over Paige's hair as she leaned into her, and Noah clutched his small backpack with both hands, ready but calm. No one was in a hurry, not after what they'd just endured. 2 rows ahead, the man in the gray suit turned halfway in his seat. He seemed to be battling something inside him, words rising and retreating. Finally, he leaned slightly toward Darren. "I should have said something," he murmured. "Back then, when it happened." Darren looked at him, eyes steady. The man cleared his throat. I wasn't sure what to do." "You were sure," Darren replied, his voice low, even. "You just chose not to." The man nodded slowly. You're right. Then he looked down at his shoes, and when he stood to get his bag, he didn't look back again. As the line of passengers thinned and more made their way toward the exit, the whispers grew louder. Small pieces of conversation. A few passengers sharing what they saw with others who hadn't noticed at first. A woman toward the rear mentioned the video already posted on social media. "It's got thousands of views already," she whispered. Someone from the front posted it with the caption, "Black woman removed from first class. Watch how it ends." Another woman nodded, her brows drawn together. "She handled it better than I would have. So calm, so composed." Elise heard it as they passed but didn't turn around. She didn't need approval. She didn't need strangers to suddenly admire her strength after watching her be humiliated. Strength wasn't for show. It was survival. At the front of the aircraft, Jenna continued helping people exit. Her smile professional but distant. When Darren and his family finally stood to leave, she stepped back respectfully, allowing them room. "You handled everything with a lot of grace," she said quietly. "Most people would have raised their voice. You didn't have to, and it still changed everything." Darren gave her a small nod. Sometimes silence speaks loudest when the world's finally ready to listen. Jenna didn't respond. She simply held the curtain aside and let them through. The jet bridge was quiet as they stepped onto it. There were no crowds, no agents blocking the path. Just space and air, and a sense that something was shifting, even if the world wasn't fully aware of it yet. But just a few feet ahead, the man in the dark suit from earlier, the airline's operations liaison, stood waiting near the gate door. His expression was composed, but he straightened his jacket quickly when he saw Darren approaching. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "we've already begun the process. Ms. Keller is in a private room being debriefed. HR is present. Security will provide their own documentation as well." Darren didn't stop walking, but his words were clear. "Make sure the documentation doesn't stay buried." "It won't," the man replied. "The footage alone ensures that. We'll be issuing a public statement this evening." Elise glanced toward the large glass windows ahead where more security and staff moved through the terminal. Beyond them, flashing lights of grounded aircraft lit the tarmac in the distance. "And the policy changes?" Darren asked. "They're being drafted now," the man said quickly. "Bias training for all crew, anonymous reporting for in-flight incidents, cross-checking of all removals before takeoff." Darren stopped. He turned fully to face the man. "Make sure it applies to every passenger, not just the ones with power." The man nodded, slower this time. "Yes, sir." Without another word, Darren turned and walked with his family into the terminal. Elise's hand rested gently on Paige's shoulder. Noah walked a step ahead, looking around, not knowing that he'd just been part of something much bigger than a bad flight. Passengers from the same plane passed them in silence, still unsure what to say, if anything. No one stopped them. No one needed to. Because even if their story had started on a plane, it wasn't going to end there. It had already taken off. The terminal was alive with movement, but the family moved through it slowly, steadily, like they weren't just walking. They were processing. The cool air of the airport stung a little sharper after what had happened on the plane, but neither Darren nor Elise showed it. They didn't speak, not yet. There was nothing to explain. Their children walked between them. Paige quietly holding her mother's hand, Noah trying to keep pace without asking the hundreds of questions that were surely building up inside him. Behind them, the other passengers trickled into the terminal, but their faces told a different story now. The confidence many of them had boarded with was gone. Some looked around nervously. Others checked their phones as if expecting the video from the flight to have already gone viral. And it had. Just past security, a digital news screen was already running a headline. "Passenger removed from first class sparks airline backlash. Owner's family involved in onboard incident." It hadn't even been 20 minutes since landing. Elise paused as they reached a quiet part of the terminal. Darren stopped beside her. She adjusted Paige's jacket and knelt briefly to tie Noah's shoelace, her fingers moving slowly. It wasn't about the shoelace. It was about breathing, about grounding herself again after a storm that hadn't started with yelling, but with dismissal. Darren's phone buzzed again. He ignored it at first. Then it buzzed a second time. He checked the screen. A new message had come through from the airline's board chair. Full internal report ordered. Press waiting on statement. Legal team wants input before we go public. He sighed. Not from frustration, but from knowing. This wasn't going to be a one-day event. This was going to ripple. And whether he liked it or not, his name, his family, their silence, their pain, it was now part of something bigger. Elise stood up again. They're already reporting it? He nodded. It was recorded. Multiple angles, words, faces. Nothing can be edited out now. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Paige tugged her mom's sleeve gently. Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Are we okay now? Elise looked down at her. We were always okay. Paige frowned a little. But she made you leave. And nobody said anything. Elise knelt again, looking her daughter in the eyes. Sometimes people don't say anything because they're scared, or unsure, or just used to things being unfair. Paige's eyes were wide. Is she going to be in trouble? Darren answered this time. She already is. They began walking again, this time toward the private lounge area where an airline representative waited to escort them to their car. The lounge had been cleared in advance. No press, no distractions, no flashes of cameras. The board knew better than to let a mistake like this become even more public in front of bystanders. Inside the lounge, fresh water, coffee, and snacks had been placed neatly on a table. A staff member greeted them nervously, unsure of how to welcome a family that had just been humiliated by the company they worked for. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I'm terribly sorry for what happened today. We've issued an emergency review order to HR and flight operations. Please, let us know if there's anything we can do right now. Darren didn't respond immediately. He looked at the man, calm but unreadable. I don't need a snack tray or coffee, he said finally. I need this to matter. The man nodded, flustered. It does, sir, truly. It's already moving up. There's been press inquiries, internal memos, everything. It's not being ignored. Elise's voice was quiet but clear. You all ignored it while it was happening. Every day, somewhere, something like this happens to people without cameras, without power, without names on boardroom walls. What happens for them? The representative didn't know what to say. Darren stepped closer, not threatening, but exact. She thought we didn't belong. She didn't see customers. She saw categories. He paused, then added, if you're serious about change, then make sure what happened today doesn't become a training example. It becomes a turning point. The man nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Then another buzz. Darren's phone, another email, this one from his personal assistant. Subject, Keller, formal apology submitted to board, requesting to send letter to Mrs. Whitmore directly. Darren looked at Elise. She already knew what it meant. Elise breathed slowly, then said, let her write, but let her mean it. Darren sent back one line. We'll read it when it arrives. He placed the phone down and looked at his family. They weren't just a story. They were the proof that silence, when filled with purpose, can echo louder than noise. And this echo was just beginning. That night, the city glowed quietly outside the windows of Darren and Elise's home. Inside, the lights were soft, the house calm. The kids had gone to bed earlier than usual, Paige curled up with her favorite stuffed rabbit, Noah snoring softly under his dinosaur blanket. Elise had tucked them in herself, brushing back their hair and whispering the same things she always did. You're safe. You're loved. You matter. But tonight, her voice had carried more weight. Not because the words were different, but because the world had tried, even briefly, to tell them the opposite. Downstairs, Darren stood in the study, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. The screen was filled with notifications, emails, news alerts, social media tags, internal communications from the airline board. The story had taken flight the moment they stepped off the plane. Multiple clips from the incident were now circulating online. One, in particular, had gone viral, shot from just behind Darren's row. It showed Elise standing calmly while Ms. Keller gestured for her to leave. The sound was clear. So was the tension. The uploader had added a caption that read, "This is what grace under pressure looks like." The comments were pouring in. She held her ground without raising her voice. That's power. Why is this still happening in 2025? The family owned the airline, and they still got profiled. Imagine what happens to people who don't own anything. Darren scrolled through the replies in silence. He hadn't posted anything, hadn't made a statement. Not yet. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood the value of waiting until the noise became still enough for his voice to matter most. Behind him, Elise entered the study, her hair tied loosely, wearing a faded college sweatshirt. She carried a folded letter in her hand. Darren looked at her, then at the paper. "It came?" he asked. She nodded. "From her, sent directly, printed and delivered to our door." Darren took the letter and unfolded it slowly. Elise didn't sit. She stood quietly, waiting. The handwriting was neat, formal, the tone careful. "Mrs. Whitmore, there is no explanation I can offer that would change what I did or how it made you feel. I saw you, your family, your calmness, your silence, and I still told myself a story that wasn't true. I didn't question your ticket. I questioned your place, and in doing so, I failed. I have worked in the skies for a decade. I've managed emergencies, calmed chaos, memorized every procedure. But I never stopped to examine what I carried quietly into every aisle I walked down. Today, I confronted that. You didn't humiliate me, I did that myself. You didn't raise your voice, and that made it louder. This isn't an apology for the board, it's for you. And I understand if you never want to accept it. But if you do read this, I hope you know I've already changed. Not because I was caught, but because I saw myself clearly for the first time. I'm sorry." Ms. Keller Darren finished reading and placed the letter on the desk. Elise still hadn't moved. "She wrote it," he said quietly. Elise gave a small nod. She meant it. I could feel it. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Elise finally sat beside him. "You think I should reply?" "That's up to you," Darren said. "You don't owe her that." "No," Elise murmured. "But maybe I owe it to myself, to answer something that was finally honest." She reached for a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She didn't write much, just a few lines. "Ms. Keller, you were right. It wasn't your first time making that judgment. Just the first time someone was watching. But you're also right about something else. I didn't humiliate you. That was your own mirror. Growth is uncomfortable, so is truth. But if you're willing to hold on to both, then maybe, just maybe, this won't happen to the next woman, the next mother, the next voice that chooses grace instead of shouting." E. Whitmore. She folded the paper and set it beside the first. Darren reached over and placed his hand over hers. They didn't speak. There was no victory lap, no celebration. Just breathe, stillness, presence. Because this wasn't a story about revenge. It was about reflection. And sometimes the clearest reflection comes not from glass or water, but from what breaks us. Elise leaned back in her chair. Outside the windows, planes moved through the sky above the city. Some arriving, some leaving. Some simply circling until they had clearance to land. And somewhere in the sky, someone like her was boarding a plane, unaware of the story she'd be part of next. But maybe, just maybe, because of this, the sky would be a little more fair tomorrow. By the next morning, the story had moved beyond social media posts and comment sections. Major news outlets were covering it, not just as an incident, but as a conversation. Headlines echoed across platforms, each carrying a variation of the same truth. Airline executives' family targeted in first-class dispute. Bias or blunder. Flight attendant removed after separating black family in first class. Grace, silence, and systemic bias. The story behind Flight 407. The footage had already been aired on 3 national morning shows, and the story was trending worldwide. public figures, activists, even airline industry experts were weighing in. Some praised Darren and Elise for their restraint. Others criticized the airline for a pattern of gatekeeping professionalism that's always aimed at the same kind of passenger. Many called it yet another example of how deep bias can run, even when policies say otherwise. But what made this story different was who it happened to, and how they responded. Darren sat at the head of the long boardroom table at the airline's headquarters that morning, not in the media spotlight, not in front of cameras, just with his team, behind closed doors. Senior executives, HR leads, and the brand communications director sat with him, all carrying the weight of what the company now had to face publicly. "This isn't just about Keller," Darren said plainly, no anger in his voice, just absolute clarity. "This is about what she reflected back to all of us. The uniform didn't make the mistake. The system that trained her to act without hesitation did." A few heads lowered. "We've written so many policies," he continued, "but we haven't changed the posture. Our staff are trained to control, not to understand. That's what let this happen." The HR director leaned forward, nervous but prepared. "We've drafted a 3-tier accountability and training revision. First, all in-flight personnel will undergo mandatory anti-bias and perception training, updated quarterly, measured anonymously by passengers. Second, we're overhauling our escalation policy. No passenger can be asked to move or relocate without verification from the in-flight system, gate staff, and a digital cross-check." Darren nodded slowly. "And the third?" The communications director took over. "We're introducing a real-time passenger reporting system. Every traveler will be able to rate their in-flight experience before the plane even touches the gate. Any flagged interaction will trigger a review, regardless of class, status, or name." Silence filled the room. One executive asked, "Are we prepared for the public backlash if this happens again?" "It will happen again," Darren replied. "Bias doesn't disappear with a press release, but when it does happen again, we'll respond like a company that learned, not like one that's just trying to protect itself." A few in the room looked visibly shaken, not by the press coverage, but by the mirror Darren was holding up. They had seen the headlines, yes, but now they were seeing the real cost. After the meeting, Darren stepped out onto the top-floor balcony, the city stretching far beneath him. Elise was already there, waiting with 2 cups of coffee in hand. She handed him one without speaking. He accepted it, still quiet. "I watched the full interview on the morning news," she said softly. "They used our names, numbered just our faces, but that was enough." He nodded, taking a sip. "Do you regret how we handled it?" Elise's gaze didn't move from the skyline. "Number not once. What I regret is how long we've carried the expectation to stay silent, to be calm, to make others feel comfortable while we're being erased." Darren breathed in deeply, the air crisp against his skin. "And yet you were still calm." "I didn't stay calm for her," Elise said. "I stayed calm for our kids, because I knew they were watching, and I wanted them to learn something different from what the world was trying to teach." He looked at her. They did. They stood there for a while, not needing to fill the silence. The sky above them was bright now, clear. But they both knew that clouds didn't need to be visible to be present. Later that day, a notice came through to Elise's email. Not from the airline, not from HR, but from a school in the Midwest. A middle school teacher had sent a message after showing her class the news clip. Subject: "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. We watched your story today in my 8th grade social studies class. My students asked why you didn't yell, why you didn't argue, why you didn't demand to be heard louder. I told them she didn't need to yell to make the whole world hear her. One of my students said, 'That's what strength looks like when it grows up.' So thank you, not just for staying calm, but for staying seen." Ms. L. Howard Elise stared at the email for a long time. Then she smiled. Not because it erased the pain of what happened, not because it made the injustice disappear, but because it meant the silence hadn't been wasted. It had become something passed from her to the next generation, from a moment of dismissal to a classroom full of eyes learning to see differently. In the sky, planes continued to fly, crews continued to board, procedures continued to repeat. But somewhere on those flights, someone who had watched that story, who had felt that story, was now thinking twice. And that, Elise knew, was how change always begins. Not in the noise, but in the noticing. The following week moved like a wave, steady, rising, and impossible to ignore. What began as a single flight and a moment of quiet prejudice had become a national conversation, but not the kind that flares up and dies down after 24 hours. This was different. It lingered, it unsettled. It reached places people thought were immune. Private boardrooms, break rooms, classrooms, church basements, family group chats. Everyone had something to say, because everyone had once sat silently through something they knew was wrong. The airline was now under close watch. Public trust was bruised. Darren's name, though never officially used in company statements, had been whispered behind closed doors across the industry. His silence had become a storm of its own. He hadn't given interviews, hadn't posted online. He didn't need to. The video of Elise being quietly escorted to the back of the plane and then brought back with a forced apology had done more than any press conference could. But now, there were invitations, offers, requests for speaking engagements, interviews, opinion pieces. Everyone wanted Darren and Elise to explain the moment, to turn it into a headline, to turn it into a message. But they weren't interested in selling a moment. They were focused on something else. They wanted change that would outlive the moment. Elise stood in the foyer of a community center in Atlanta, where a small nonprofit was hosting a roundtable on dignity and public service. The room wasn't filled with press or politicians. It was filled with nurses, bus drivers, security officers, school janitors, flight attendants, single parents, people who lived in uniforms, who lived under systems where being respected was a daily gamble. A woman in her 50s stood at the front, microphone in hand. We all saw the video, and most of us weren't surprised, because we know what it's like to be looked at like we don't belong. We know what it's like to pay full price and still be treated like a favor. There were murmurs of agreement around the room. But what stuck with me, the woman continued, wasn't what they did to you, Elise. It's how you responded. You didn't fight to prove your worth. You knew it already, and you gave that lesson to your children in real time. I've never seen strength wrapped in silence like that. Elise stood slowly and accepted the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't read from paper. I've sat in a lot of rooms where people expected me to prove I deserved to be there, she began. That flight wasn't the first time I was asked to move without cause. It was just the first time the world watched it happen. Heads nodded across the room. I didn't stay quiet because I was weak, she said. I stayed quiet because I've learned that the real test isn't whether you can raise your voice, but whether you can carry your worth in rooms that try to shrink you. A heavy silence followed. Then applause. Not loud, not wild. Just long, deep. A room full of people who felt seen. Later that night, Elise and Darren walked through the park near their home. The air was cool and the city lights sparkled on the water by the walking path. They walked without speaking for a while. Just being together was enough. Then Darren said, "They're going to ask again. For us to speak. For you to speak." "I know," Elise said. "They'll want a platform, a series, maybe a partnership with the airline." "I don't want a campaign," she replied. "I want prevention." He nodded. "Then we'll build something better, quietly, but fully." They walked a little farther, passing a young couple pushing a stroller, two teens skateboarding near the benches, and a bus driver on his break sipping coffee from a paper cup. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, each carrying battles the world never sees. "I got another letter," Elise said quietly, "from a woman who said her daughter now insists on sitting next to her on every flight. Not because she's afraid, but because she doesn't want to be silent anymore." Darren looked at her. "That's it then." "What?" "That's how we know we did the right thing. Not because people agreed, Not because someone got fired, but because something started growing in people. They stopped walking. "I don't want what happened to be remembered as the time we were disrespected," Elise said. "Then what do you want it remembered as?" Darren asked. Elise looked out over the water, her voice sure. "The time people finally noticed who was missing from the table and started pulling up more chairs." Darren smiled. "Then we'll keep building the table." And they stood there a moment longer, two people who had been seen, judged, dismissed, and finally understood. Not because they demanded to be heard, but because they refused to be erased. The moment had passed, but the movement had just begun. The ripple effect reached places even Darren and Elise hadn't anticipated. Schools began updating their staff training on unconscious bias. A regional airline announced a full audit of its in-flight incident reports over the past 5 years. Another competitor introduced anonymous crew evaluations on every flight, immediately, not just for premium cabins. And slowly, the conversations in boardrooms began to shift. Not just the public-facing statements or polished diversity pledges, but the quiet, uncomfortable conversations behind closed doors. The kind of conversations where truth has no polite filter. But even with all this movement, Elise remained cautious. She had seen too many moments turn into headlines and then vanish without leaving anything behind. She wasn't interested in attention. She was interested in what stayed behind once the spotlight moved on. And still, the letters came. One afternoon, she sat by the window at home with a stack of handwritten notes spread across the table. Some came from young girls who had watched the clip and asked their mothers why the woman was told to leave her seat. Others came from elderly passengers who shared moments they had carried in silence for decades, moments where they, too, had been asked to move, or told they were confused, or in the wrong place, all while knowing they were exactly where they were supposed to be. One letter stood out. It was written in small, neat handwriting on yellow-lined paper. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm 17. I watched the video from the plane in my history class. I'm not rich. I've never even been on a plane. But I understood that moment. Not because I've lived it exactly, but because I've seen people like my mom be treated like that in the grocery store. Or my dad when he wears a hoodie in the wrong neighborhood. You didn't scream. You didn't break anything. You just sat there like the seat belonged to you. And that's what made it so powerful. That's what stayed with me. I'm not going to forget that. So, thank you." Jalen M. Elise read the letter 3 times. She folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box she had started filling with similar notes. She didn't keep them for validation. She kept them because they were proof. That one moment of calm defiance had grown legs, stretched across places they'd never been, and planted something in hearts they'd never meet. Upstairs, Darren was finishing a video call with the airline's ethics review committee. They had asked him to participate, not as a board member, but as a witness, a representative, the man whose silence had sent the loudest signal. "Change isn't an event," Darren said on the call. "It's a structure. You don't fix it with apologies. You fix it by making sure the same thing doesn't keep happening to people who can't afford to send a message straight to the board." One of the committee members, a woman in her 60s with deep lines of exhaustion and wisdom in her face, said softly, "I've been working in policy reform for 20 years, but this feels like something we were finally forced to see, and seeing doesn't go backwards." Darren nodded. "That's the hope." Later that evening, he joined Elise in the living room. The box of letters sat on the coffee table between them. Darren opened one gently, read a few lines, then placed it back. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "They asked if I wanted to create a public response campaign." Elise raised an eyebrow. "You said no?" "I said not yet." She nodded. "We're not done listening yet." He looked at her and smiled. "Exactly." They sat in quiet understanding, the television off, the world outside the windows muted by dusk. Paige and Noah had gone to bed early again, still young but a little wiser now. They asked more questions lately. Not about cartoons or snacks, but about right and wrong. About why grown-ups act unfairly. About how to speak up without shouting. And Darren and Elise answered honestly every time. "We tell them what we wish someone had told us," Elise said once. That had become their unspoken mission now. To give their children the words they were once forced to figure out alone. To build a home where dignity wasn't something they had to earn, but something they never doubted they already owned. Before they turned in for the night, Darren's phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something told him to check. It was a message from a woman named Dana Rowley. No title, no profile picture, just a short message. "I was on that flight. I didn't speak. I should have. I'm sorry. If you're building something to make sure this never happens again, I want to help." He showed it to Elise. She smiled, then whispered, "One voice at a time." And that night, long after the world had stopped talking and the headlines had moved to the next thing, Darren and Elise rested. Not because the work was over, but because the silence had finally started speaking for itself. Weeks passed. The world, as it often does, shifted its gaze to newer stories. Different headlines, fresher outrages, louder scandals. The viral clip from Flight 407, once shared across every platform, was no longer trending. It had been pushed down by entertainment buzz and breaking news. But that didn't mean it disappeared, because something had been planted. Not a slogan, not a campaign, but something far quieter. A standard. It began to show itself in subtle ways. A school principal adjusted their discipline policy after re-watching the footage of Elise being removed without cause. A chain of restaurants added empathy-based training for staff who interacted with diverse families and guests. A library in Houston launched a public reading series called The Right to Belong, where community members shared moments they had been made to feel invisible and how they reclaimed their space. And on flights around the country, things began to feel different. A mother traveling alone with 2 children was treated with extra patience, not pity. A man in worn clothes who held a first-class ticket wasn't questioned when he took his seat. A black woman with a quiet voice and strong posture received not suspicion, but service. These were not press-worthy changes. They were small, nearly invisible, but they were real. In the airline's internal culture, Flight 407 had become known, not as a scandal, but as a reference point. New flight attendants were trained with excerpts from the transcript. Staff were shown clips, not of outrage, but of Elise sitting in silence, being asked to move, and being brought back. Not because she protested, but because the world finally paused long enough to recognize what it had always ignored. For Darren and Elise, life didn't slow down, but it deepened. Darren continued serving on the board, though now he asked sharper questions. He pushed for data transparency, demographics of passenger complaints, patterns of crew decisions, audits of incident response. He no longer assumed the system was fair. He wanted to know. He wanted to see. And Elise, who had once kept her public life small, now found herself speaking to groups she'd never imagined, but always on her own terms. She turned down television interviews and refused branding offers. She didn't want her dignity sold as content. What she wanted, what she demanded, was for every woman who looked like her, who lived like her, to never have to trade silence for survival again. She created a quiet foundation with Darren's support, offering legal guidance and emotional support to passengers who faced discrimination mid-flight and had no voice strong enough to be heard on the ground. No billboards, no commercials, just real resources, hand to hand. One evening, almost 2 months after that flight, Elise and Darren sat outside in their backyard. The children were asleep upstairs. Wind rustled gently through the trees. Above them, planes blinked quietly against the night sky, tiny, distant, moving from place to place without anyone below knowing who sat inside. Darren looked up. Somewhere out there, another family is boarding a flight. Elise followed his gaze, and someone's deciding where they think they belong. Darren turned to her. "Do you ever wish we had said something louder that day, done more?" She shook her head. We did enough. The world was loud already. What it needed was stillness. She leaned back in her chair, wrapped in a light sweater, and continued. We weren't trying to make a moment. We were trying to survive one. And the fact that it echoed? That wasn't planned. That was truth rising on its own. Darren smiled. Truth rises. I like that. It always does, she said. Eventually. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with hers, warm and steady. A notification buzzed on Darren's phone, face down on the table, but he didn't reach for it. Not this time. They didn't need the next headline. They had done what they came to do. Not for attention, not for revenge. But so the next time someone like Elise sat in a seat she rightfully owned, no one would question whether she belonged there. And if they did, there would be someone watching, someone ready, someone who remembered that story, not just because it was powerful, but because it made them ask the right question. Not who do you think you are, but why did we ever ask that in the first place? The stars above flickered. The sky held steady. And somewhere, high above it, another flight passed through quietly, its passengers unaware that the air around them had been changed by one woman's silence, and the family that never let go of her seat. If this story meant something to you, give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories coming your way soon.